Okay, Dalal, I'm just going to jump in there because the UN Secretary General is talking and we just want to hear what he has to say.
Sadly, these numbers are expected to rise as the attacks are ongoing and many remain unaccounted for. In addition, over 100, possibly more, Israelis, civilians and military have been reported captured by armed groups, including women, children and the elderly. Some are being held hostage inside Israel, and many others have been taken inside the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad have launched thousands of indiscriminate rockets that have reached central Israel, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I recognize the legitimate grievances of the Palestinian people, but nothing can justify these acts of terror and the killing, maiming and abduction of civilians. I reiterate my call to immediately cease these attacks and release all hostages. In the face of these unprecedented attacks, Israeli airstrikes have pounded Gaza. I'm deeply alarmed by reports of over 500 Palestinians, including women and children, killed in Gaza and over 3,000 injured. Unfortunately, these numbers are rising by the minute as Israeli operations continue. While I recognize Israel's legitimate security concerns, I also remind Israel that military operations must be conducted in strict accordance with international humanitarian law. Civilians must be respected and protected at all times. Civilian infrastructure must never be a target. And we already have reports of Israeli missiles striking health facilities inside Gaza, as well as multi-storied residential towers and a mosque. Two UNRWA schools sheltering displaced families in Gaza were also hit. Some 137,000 people are currently sheltering in UNRWA facilities, with the number increasing as heavy shelling and airstrikes continue. I am deeply distressed by today's announcement that Israel will initiate a complete siege of the Gaza Strip, nothing allowed in, no electricity, food or fuel. The humanitarian situation in Gaza was extremely dire before these hostilities. Now it will only deteriorate exponentially. Medical equipment, food, fuel and other humanitarian supplies are desperately needed, along with access for humanitarian personnel. Relief and entry of essential supplies into Gaza must be facilitated, and the UN will continue efforts to provide aid to respond to these needs. And I urge all sides and the relevant parties to allow United Nations access to deliver urgent humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians trapped and helpless in the Gaza Strip. And I appeal to the international community to mobilize immediate humanitarian support for these efforts. The UN Special Coordinator and I are engaging with leaders in the region to express our concern, our outrage, and to advance efforts to avoid any spillover to the wider Middle East. Even in these worst of times, and perhaps especially in the most trying moments, it is vital to look to the long-term horizon and avoid irreversible action that would embolden extremists and doom any prospects for lasting peace. This most recent violence does not come in a vacuum. The reality is that it grows out of a long-standing conflict with a 56-year-long occupation and no political end in sight. It's time to end this vicious circle of bloodshed, hatred, and polarization. Israel must see its legitimate needs for security materialized, and Palestinians must see a clear perspective for the establishment of their own state realized. Only a negotiated peace that fulfills the legitimate national aspirations of Palestinians and Israelis, together with their security alike, the long-held vision of a two-state solution in line with United Nations resolutions, international law and previous agreements, can bring long-term stability to the people of this land and the wider Middle East region. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
That was a speech given by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He was addressing the situation there in Gaza and Israel, saying he's deeply concerned by events, recognises the grievances on both sides, but calls for an end to attacks from both sides. Let's bring in Shihab Rattansi. He's live for us at the United Nations. Shihab, what Guterres was saying is pretty much in line, isn't it, with what one would expect to hear from the United Nations?
Right, but I know you just missed the beginning of that statement. So just to summarise what he said he just concluded an extraordinary meeting of senior UN leaders to discuss the unprecedented developments in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, and then he repeated what he said was his, quote, utter condemnation of the abhorrent attacks by Hamas and others against Israeli towns and villages. And I think then you kind of pretty much caught up with the statement. As you say, yes. What does the UN Security Secretary General do? He repeats the importance of international humanitarian law, the need for proportionality and the Geneva Conventions to be respected. At a time, though, he's doing this, though, when clearly the Israelis and the Israeli Defense Ministry have already said they are going to intensify the siege of Gaza. The defense minister in Israel called the Palestinians animals. So clearly this is directly a violation already of international law, international humanitarian law and proportionality. But we saw there the Secretary General then sort of balancing things out by saying, well, we're very concerned about the siege. We want to continue UN deliveries into Gaza. But meanwhile, even the Palestinians' aspirations, while legitimate security, legitimate grievances, they can't justify acts of terror towards Israel as well. So it's kind of classic UN Secretary General, even as we see the utter flouting of everything that the United Nations actually stands for.
And Shihab, what about the UN Security Council? That's what we're hearing from the Secretary General. What are we hearing from the Council?
Nothing now, nothing today. We did have that meeting, those closed consultations on Sunday, and it was striking, though, whom we heard from. We heard from the US ambassador, who had a very different message to the UN Secretary General. His message was pretty much just the green light for for Israel to do anything it basically wants. We heard from the Israeli ambassador to the UN, who wasn't at those closed consultations, who said that all of Gaza was part of the Hamas war machine and would now be a target. We heard from the Palestinian mission, which said, effectively, we've been warning you about this might happen. The Palestinians are going to try and achieve their aspirations by one way or another. We kept on saying, let's go the peaceful route. It's still not too late for the peaceful route. But, we did warn you over and over again here. And we heard from the Chinese and Russians. The Chinese saying it would be good to have a Security Council statement. They're against any violence against civilians. The Russians saying, look, this is just a result of decades of the US's stewardship of the Middle East peace process. We need an immediate ceasefire and we need immediate negotiations. So it's interesting, and the UAE actually also spoke, the ambassador there, who said, look, we want an end to the violence and an end to attacks on civilians. So those who chose to speak in the main, who weren't either the Israelis or the US, were saying we need to pause in the violence, but the US and Israel clearly had a completely different message.
OK, Shihab Rattansi joining us live from the United Nations. Thanks very much, Shihab.